Africa is home to some of the world's richest natural resources. Sitting on a treasure trove of untapped potential, Africa has over 30% of the world's mineral reserves. No wonder Africa has been seen as the future of global supply chains.
But it's not just about the minerals. Africa's fertile land makes it the perfect place to cultivate a variety of crops, everything from cocoa, coffee and tea to cassava, maize and legumes. It's a market that feeds billions and offers huge growth potential for investors looking at the future of food security and agribusiness. By the way, my name is Hawa and I represent the western part of Africa.
And that's just the start. Africa's energy sector is rapidly evolving with abundant natural resources like solar, wind, and hydropower. The continent is positioned to become a global leader in renewable energy. Countries like South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya are already making significant strides towards energy independence and sustainability.
Don't even get me started about what makes Africa stand out. Of course, it's its people, the young, dynamic, and entrepreneurial spirit that is fueling the rise of technology and innovation. We are seeing incredible growth in sectors like fintech, e-commerce, and mobile technology. The continent's digital transformation is creating new opportunities for businesses and investors, and the pace is only accelerating.
Discussing trends, challenges, and opportunities available in Africa is what we discuss on Invest Africa Podcast.
Invest Africa Podcast.
You are Africans. We are Africans. Louder. We are Africans. Louder. We are Africans. Come on, Africans. Yeah. We are Africans. I can't hear you. We are Africans. Louder. We are Africans. Come on, Africans.
So whether you are a seasoned investor or someone looking to explore the emerging markets, the Invest Africa podcast is here to help you navigate this exciting landscape. Join us as we take you on a journey through Africa's abundant resources, thriving industries, and the game-changing investments that are shaping the future of the continent.
The Invest Africa Podcast, shaping Africa's investment landscape. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Invest Africa Group podcast. I am Mubarak Abimbola, joined as always by my co-host Awa Adegbite. Today we are stepping into a topic that is rarely talked about, yet affects millions across the continent. One that sits at the intersection of health, education, and human potential. We're talking about autism, neurodiversity, and developmental neurology in Africa. A space that is both misunderstood and under-addressed, but increasingly urgent for Africa's future.
Hi guys, thanks Mubarak. Yes, Mubarak has said it. Today our focus is autism and neurodiversity in Africa, the hidden health crisis, right? Over the next few hours, we'll unpack what the World Health Organization and UNICEF are revealing about autism and other developmental conditions in Africa. We'll also talk about, cultural attitudes and the heavy weight of stigma and how, they shape diagnosis and supports. Right? We'll look at where the funding goes, what's missing in healthcare and education systems, and how countries like the UK or the US compare to realities here in Africa. You hear data, stories, and like we always do, real-life examples from across the continent. And for those who follow us for the investment insights, don't worry, we've got you covered too, because we highlight where inclusive health, education, and assistive tech are opening up space for meaningful investments.
All right, throughout this conversation, we'll also take you on the systems, numbers, and opportunities while connecting it all to real human stories and cultural experiences. Trust us on that, okay? We also want to keep things engaging, honest, and maybe even a bit personal along the way. So wherever you are tuning in from, whether you are on a commute, doing chores, or just taking a quiet moment, you need to settle in, okay? You might want to grab a notebook because this one is packed with insight that challenge how we see disability, health, and equity in Africa. All right, Awa, I don't kick us off with how we actually define autism and neurodiversity and what the global data tell us so far.
So let's start from the basics, right? What exactly are we talking about when we say autism or neurodiversity, right? Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD like it's commonly called, is a neurodevelopmental condition that affects how people communicate, how they interact socially, and how they basically process the world around them. But when we talk about neurodiversity, we are going even broader. We mean the natural range of how the brain works and processes information. So that includes autism, attention deficits, hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, other learning and intellectual disability, as well as developmental differences that are often invisible but very real. Now, talking about data, according to the World Health Organization's 2023 fact sheet, about 1 in every 100 children globally is estimated to have autism. But here's the catch. In many low and middle income countries, including large parts of Africa, the actual data are missing or just incomplete. That means we are just working with guesses rather than solid numbers.
That's so true, Awaf. UNICEF 2023 Global Report on Children with Developmental Disabilities highlights that around 317 million children and adolescents worldwide, live with conditions that contribute to developmental disabilities, including autism. If you ask me, 317 million children and adolescents, that's huge, yeah? And when you realize how little we know about the African picture, it becomes even more concerning and worrisome. Recent reviews estimate that autism prevalence across Africa countries may be around 1%, give or take, and similar to global levels. But the problem isn't the number, if you ask me. You made mention that we might be working with guesses. I don't really have a problem with the numbers. It is everything that happens after that I really worry about, yeah? In many African societies, diagnoses come late. Stigma runs deep and support systems are underfunded or non-existent. Families are often left to navigate it alone, and that has ripple effect. A ripple effect that includes emotional, economic, and even educational. So yes, the prevalence may be similar to that of Europe or that of Asia or elsewhere, but the impact here is much heavier, and that's why we are calling it a hidden crisis, because the silence around it keeps the problem alive.
Absolutely. Now let's zoom out a bit and look at the funding, the systems and infrastructure side of things, because awareness and diagnosis, like we said, are important. But if there is no structured pathway, from diagnosis to support and even inclusion, the burden will continue to stay on families indefinitely. And this is exactly where smart investment like public, private, or philanthropic investment comes in. They can actually create real change now. Let's start with the funding streams and big initiatives that currently exist. The World Bank, for example, is doing a lot across the world, especially in Africa. They launched Disability Inclusive Education in Africa program back in 2017. It's a trust fund worth about $3 million aimed at helping children with disabilities access education and support governments to build inclusive school systems.
Apart from that of the World Bank investment, there's also one in Nigeria that I think I read of. That's the SMILE project, which was implemented between 2019 and 2023, if I'm not mistaken. It was a UK aid funded through Sight Savers, and it focuses on making education more inclusive and improving access for children with disabilities. And there are many other foundations and grant programs popping up across the continent. Just last month, I can tell you that an international database listed over a dozen outgoing intellectual and developmental disabilities grant opportunities across Africa. The UN estimates that roughly 80 million Africans live with disabilities. That's 80 million people whose participation in the economy is often limited by the systems, not by ability. Yeah? Philanthropy briefs now talk about disability inclusive funding as major frontier for social impact, meaning investors now can now partner with disability-focused organizations for both measurable impact and sustainable outcomes.
It's good to know that there are funding coming in, for different initiatives into Africa. But let's be honest, right? The gaps are still massive. There was a UNICEF report in 2023 that says that 29 million children, an estimation, in Africa lives with disabilities. Yet, there is no reliable data on them. And we all know that without information, without data, planning and funding will just become guesswork, right? And let's not even talk about the education gap. We still see, we are still struggling with education, not to now talk of special needs education. There was another UNICEF report in 2022 that says that African countries' shortfall in funding for special needs education was over $5.5 million. And in some places, that amount is even dropping to about 75%. And when you look at it, it's just alarming, because if there is no education for special needs, how do we now actually tackle the problem?
I quite agree with you, right? But let's also include that policy is also another weak link in this whole conversation. A 2024 continental study by the African Committee of Experts on the Right and Welfare of the Child, found out that although most African states have ratified disability rights treaties, implementation is still paper deep. We all know laws exist, but the execution, funding, and accountability don't follow through. In healthcare, the gap is even wider. Services for neurodevelopmental assessment like autism or ADHD screening are mostly urban-based. Even in the urban area, probably you will see one or two places that allow for autism or ADHD screening. Families in rural areas or semi-urban areas have to travel hours, even days, to find a specialist. And even then, the tools used aren't always culturally validated, so diagnosis can be inconsistent or delayed oftentimes. Schools too also face barriers, lack of trained teachers, limited access to assistive technology, outdated curricula, poor infrastructure, you name it, yeah? For many children, the system itself is disabling, if you ask me.
Absolutely. Now, compare that with countries like the United Kingdom, where early diagnosis, specialized education plans, and even funding mechanisms like NHS support and local authority budgets are already a standard. While in Africa, on the other hand, even with laws like Nigeria's Discrimination Against Persons with Disability Act, national commissions are underfunded and often inactive. In fact, there's poor management wherever you might find little funds. Families still carry the emotional and financial load almost entirely on their own, right? So from an investment or policy perspective, this is a space wide open for innovation. There's unmet demand for early diagnosis tools, rural outreach programs, teacher training, assistive tech, and even data systems. Each of these different niches represents a chance to build systems that are both humane and sustainable. But before we go into the opportunities for investors, and pitfalls like we always do, let's try to bring this to life, what it actually looks and feels like on the ground.
Yeah, thank God you mentioned that. I think we should paint a real picture and real life experiences behind those statistics we've mentioned. Take the story of Amina, for example. Although not a real name, for the purpose of this context, we do not want to reveal the real names of people involved. Amina, a mother from a semi-urban area in Kenya, she has a 6-year-old son who didn't speak full sentences by age 4. Currently, the boy is around age 6, and the boy could not speak or form a full sentence by age 4. And the boy also had difficulty in socializing and was constantly labeled as stubborn or slow, as the case may be. So like so many parents, I had no idea what autism was and took our son to several doctors, pediatricians, general physicians. But it never occurred to anybody to suggest a developmental screening. Look at how deep that is. None of the doctors could even suggest that, they should probably do a developmental screening up until the boy was 5. Yeah. So the nearest hospital for the screening was about 50 kilometers away. Transport cost was high. And, they didn't have health insurance. By the time the son finally got an assessment, he had already fallen behind socially and academically. Teachers in his mainstream school said he was too disruptive, and the family eventually had to transfer him to a special class in a private school. And this cost about 3 times the initial school fees they were paying before. So to make things work, I had to cut our work hours. Our husband missed work to accompany them to appointments. And their other children's schooling also suffered because they had a boy with a special need. The emotional strain, the stigma from neighbors, even the whispers at school, all of it took toll on Amina, took toll on the other sibling, took toll on the child, took toll on the father. Hardly can he concentrate at work. The boy has to go for an assessment. All these things can be draining, I must tell you.
Absolutely. This story you just gave us actually captures most of the burden of, this issue we're talking about, autism, of developmental or learning disabilities. Because we've seen the financial toll, we've seen the stigma, we've seen the emotional toll. Now, imagine if Amina's son had been diagnosed at maybe 2 years old. It would have gotten early intervention support like speech therapy or inclusion support, and it could have actually stayed in mainstream school. It could have built more confidence and just basically thrived, right? That gap between early and late intervention isn't just a personal thing. It's economic, like you just described, right? It's potential loss for the child, for the family, and for the country. And this particular story repeats across Africa in different dynamics. In Lagos, Nigeria, for example, the Winford Center for Children and Women, founded by Dr. Basirat Razak Shuaib, works with children with autism, ADHD, and developmental disabilities. They shared countless cases of families who come in after years of misdiagnosis or denial, right? Some were told, you outgrow it, or it's a spiritual issue. And by the time they reach proper support, parents are exhausted, children are anxious. They are not just willing to get out of the situation. And by that time, the financial burden has already tripled. These stories remind us that behind every data point is a person, is a family doing their best in a system that often fails them. So when we talk about disability inclusion, we're not just looking at charity work, we're looking at nation building, we're looking at support systems, because it affects workforce potential, it affects education outcome, it affects social cohesion, it affects basically everything.
Well, you're so right. One point you made that I really relate to so well is that is the spiritual issue that most people tend to, diagnose developmental issue to be, most especially in Africa. You would hear that it's a spiritual case. They should take the boy or take the child to church or mosque. And you ask yourself, this is 21st century. You should be educated to know that all these things has nothing to do with spiritual issue. And this is also compounded by the fact that there is funding and infrastructural gaps. And when we talk about all these gaps, it's not just numbers, it is life, it is future that we are talking about. And that's why this conversation is so important. Now, let's take this conversation global for a minute, because it is one thing to understand what is happening in Africa, but it is also another thing to see how other countries have built their systems and what we can learn from them. Let's start with the United Kingdom, for example, a reference case. In the United Kingdom, children showing signs of autism or developmental delays are typically screened very early, often through the NHS or community pediatric services. From there, families are referred to specialist diagnostic unit. And all these places like children and adolescent mental health services, I think they call it CAMS over there, or autism specific clinics. Schools too are part of this system. They operate under the Special Education Needs and Disability Framework, and that's the SEND Code of Practice, which mandates inclusion. So they have a system designed to accommodate children with developmental needs. So all these children have formal education, they have healthcare and care plans already integrated into the system for them with trained support assistants, therapists, and access to assistive technology. And all this burden is not on their parents, the financial burden is not on the family, the mental burden is not on the family alone, because the whole system, the whole country carries it as its own developmental strides that needs to be achieved. The children are not left alone. They do not allow them to just be on their own or go to a special needs school where they have to feel ostracized. They are integrated into the system. And I think African can also copy this model.
Basically, it's a whole ecosystem. It means kids are identified early, supported consistently, and included meaningfully. It's structured, and that structure changes everything. Now, contrast that. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but let's contrast that with most African countries. Let's take a few examples. In Nigeria, for instance, the giant of Africa, the 2018 Discrimination Against Persons with Disability Act, I mentioned that earlier, was actually a big step. But implementation is the problem. Agencies tasked with disability inclusions are underfunded, special education is uneven and quite expensive, and most diagnosis and therapy services are private or NGO run. South Africa, on the other hand, is ahead in policy and infrastructure compared to many African countries. But even there, a 2022 Western Cape study still found autism prevalent as low as 0.08% in the region. 0.08, right? And experts claim that this signals a massive underdiagnosis of the issue.
And then there you have Kenya, Uganda, and much of rural Africa where diagnosis is even often delayed until age 5 or beyond. And if diagnosis is delayed, automatically you will know the services are scarce, traditional beliefs still dominate, and inclusive schooling is still in the pilot phase at best. In many communities, children with autism are either hidden or mislabeled. I mean, it's really tough on these kids. You see parents hiding the disability, or those that are even confident to take the developmental challenges head on, they are mislabeled, and that stigma just reinforces the cycle. When you line all this up, you see 5 key differences jump out clearly. The first one being early screening and diagnosis, like what they have in the UK. The universal health coverage, community-based child health services, and trained professionals allow for early screening and early diagnosis. African does not have this. Even if they do, it is always limited to big cities. Yeah. Another difference we can point from there is inclusive education and teacher capacity. UK teachers are trained to handle diverse learners. In Africa, most mainstream teachers have never been equipped to teach neurodiverse students. In fact, it's Africa whereby someone that did not study education, that has no experience in teaching, is teaching in the classrooms. So even our mainstream education sector is already disenfranchised, not to talk about the neurodiverse educational sector. So it is quite restrictive for teachers because they have no prior knowledge of neurodiverse education. They have no knowledge of handling developmental issues. Another difference we can point out between Africa and developed nations would be the assistive technology and resources that is available in the UK. Schools receive funds from SEN units, support assistance, and learning adaptation. In Africa, even basic assistive devices or materials are missing. They are missing. If you go to schools that have been designed for students with disabilities, you still realize that they don't even have assistive devices to help them to aid in their learning. Not to talk of students or children with neurodiverse or developmental challenges. Then you start to ask, how do we intend to integrate all of these people into the system?
I like that you mentioned integration, right? Because another key difference that we can look out is societal attitude and implementation. In the UK, our inclusion is a legal right. You have to do it. You can't use derogatory words. You have to be inclusive in all your structures. While in many African countries, inclusion is more of a wish than a practice. The stigma is still heavy, and even when law exists, enforcement is weak. Another thing we can look at is investment at scale. The UK's ecosystem is backed, most developing countries' ecosystem is backed by public funds, private innovation, and philanthropic partners. In Africa, funding is still piecemeal. NGOs hold the line while states lag behind. The implication is pretty clear. There's a gap between what is and what could be, and that gap is massive. But, we can also see this gap as a space for opportunity, not just in creating services now, but in scaling already existing initiatives, already existing efforts, in scaling teachers' training, designing culturally valid screening tools, expanding rural outreach, for example, building data systems, and normalizing inclusive education. And that's like the beauty of this conversation. The social return on investment is huge. So every child included, every teacher trained, every parent that is empowered, that's a long-term human capital growth for the continent. Okay, so one inspiring example is what Disability Africa is doing currently. It's actually based in the UK, but works directly with several African countries. And that just shows, what NGOs are doing in trying to bridge the divide on the ground. Their mission at Disability Africa is simple, but quite impactful. And that is to improve outcomes for disabled children who are too often left behind. They've observed that in many low-income areas, which is very true, disabled children face multifaceted layers of exclusion. No access to school, no access to transport, no therapy, stigma, no funding, just to mention a few. Sometimes they are actually locked indoors because of community stigma. So Disability Africa tackles this through what they call inclusive play projects. These are community-led programs that transform how people see and interact with disability. And they are using arts, play, storytelling, and safe spaces to actually push this initiative.
Thank you, Awa, for bringing my attention to what Disability Africa is doing. While I was reading about them, I noticed that their model focused on local empowerment, community volunteers, parents, and local leaders. They bring them together to make inclusion practical, not just theoretical. It is low cost, scalable, and culturally grounded. But even with this kind of innovation, we have to be honest with ourselves. Disability Africa also faces serious challenges. The biggest one is funding sustainability. Many grants are short-term, meaning once the project ends, momentum can be lost. And then there's the geographical coverage. Reaching rural communities where stigma is strongest is both logistically and financially hard. Yeah, teacher capacity and retention is also another issue. Yeah, training program often start well, but they don't often last long enough to change the whole system. And without data and good metrics, it is always difficult to prove impact or attract investors who want evidence-based results. So whenever I ask myself, every time I see the work model of Disability Africa, I ask myself, why don't we have so many replica of all these startups or all these NGOs? But I realized that these are some of the challenges Disability Africa is also facing, which makes it difficult for us to have more organizations that are planning to take up this role. So as an investor, as a partner in progress, as a listener, you already know some of the challenges that these organizations are facing, and you can already build ground up. You can already mitigate against many of these challenges ahead of time.
I'm just thinking about it now, Mubarak. Why a lot of NGOs or why the funding is quite low for developmental disabilities like autism and the rest. So I think it's a matter of priority. Right? Funding comes into the country, international donors, sometimes government efforts, but priority just started shifting towards developmental disability in Africa. You mentioned something about spiritual problems earlier. It was quite engraved in spiritual or family problems, or they just ignore it, or the child will outgrow the issue, right? Africans didn't really see developmental disability as something that needed to be taken note of. And that's where takes us to social attitude, right? Some families still fear that including children with disability will slow down the rest of the class, right? Or they don't just understand that neurodiversity actually means something. They don't know what it means. So changing mindsets, takes time, consistency, and trust. So what we are seeing here is this huge contrast. The UK model shows us what's possible when systems align, while the African context shows what happens when they don't. But it also shows that innovations can thrive, because between these two words lies an incredible space for transformation. And we are starting to see that gap now in some places thanks to NGOs, educators, and parents pushing for change. So, Mubarak, I think it's the perfect time for us to switch things up a bit. Let's head into the trending investment news. And after that, we'll break down the biggest opportunities and pitfalls that lies for investors who want to make a genuine impact in Africa's inclusive health and education sector.
All right, like you said, let's shift gears a bit from health and education to what's trending on the investment front. Okay, there's actually a lot happening in the disability and neurodiversity space that investors should start paying attention to, especially across Africa. Starting with Nigeria's $8 billion inclusive capital roadmap. Yeah, according to the Impact Investors Foundation, Nigeria has launched its gender equity and social inclusion GESI roadmap 2025 to 2035, okay? And the target is to mobilize $8 billion over the next decade for gender inclusive and disability inclusive investment. The roadmap was unveiled in Lagos at the 3rd Gender Impact Investment Summit, and the blueprint includes launching 40 inclusive financial products for women, youth, and persons with disabilities, and achieving 19% adoption of GESI principles among general partners. Now, why this matters, you might ask, is that it shows that impact investors in Africa are explicitly including disability and inclusion in their capital mobilization target. This opens space for inclusive education, inclusive tech startups, to tap into specialized funding, looking for inclusive deals.
Okay, so the International Institute for Education Planning in Africa has initiated a 4-month online training that would run from the last quarter of 2025 till January 2026, titled fundamentals of education sector planning for the inclusion of persons with disability, and this is trying to equip education sector actors in West Africa to design disability inclusive education systems. This is quite important because it builds the human capacity and system planning side, which is quite vital for inclusive education to scale. Right, the training will definitely strengthen the ecosystem in Africa. And as the ecosystem strengthens for investors, the demand side also, like schools, systems, support systems, becomes more receptive to inclusive edtech and screening tools. So you might want to actually look into that.
Also in Uganda, a 5-year project titled Unlocking the Potential for Enhanced Teaching and Learning of the Visually Impaired in Uganda Public Universities. It's called Atterview. It's funded by the Macri University Research and Innovation Fund, MACRIF, and has trained more than 80 academic staff and 100 students with visual impairment, and developed an online course called Supporting Learning of Students with Visual Impairment. Okay, one thing I love about this project is the fact that it emphasizes assistive technology as key to improving educational access. This shows concrete rollout of assistive tech in higher education in Africa, not just pilot talk, but real implementation.
We're also seeing corporate social responsibility popping up in Uganda. Still talking about Uganda. MTN Uganda donated approximately 10,000 USD in assistive technology and infrastructure like Braille's, Just software, white mobility canes, audio recorders, to St. Mary Goretti Secondary School in Uganda. And this has supported several visually impaired students. This is a real example of private sector partnership in inclusive education, and kudos to MTN Uganda for taking such a bold step, right? Corporate social responsibilities and strategic giving can actually precede investment opportunities, and such interventions may seed markets.
I think I like this particular one I'm about to take, yeah? ISCO Africa's Disability and Inclusion Program in South Africa. They use Apple technology and accessibility feature, among other interventions. And they have been named the winner of the Zero Project Award 2025. Okay, out of 522 nominations from 90 countries, the program operates in 36 schools covering needs such as autism, low vision, deafness, cerebral palsy, and dyslexia. And why this matters is that it demonstrates scalable inclusive education, innovation tied to tech, not just manual accommodation. And from the investor's perspective, it validates that inclusive edtech is gaining recognition and could attract investors, looking for a scalable, award-winning models.
It's good to see that inclusive education is becoming something that is quite recognized. Moving on, according to the news agency of Nigeria, NAN, the Agatha Obiageli Memorial Foundation has advocated for NGOs to partner with tech firms using AI, solar-powered tablet, and digital ops to bridge the gap in inclusive education, especially for learners with disabilities. This bold move emphasized that government alone cannot handle all inclusive education needs, and tech or NGO partnerships are essential. This just speaks to the catalytic role of tech and NGO collaboration for inclusive education in Africa. While we have NGOs to push for advocacy, to go to the grassroots and actually help to mobilize some of these, we need the tech industry to bring up solutions, to bring up innovations. And this shows a narrative and ecosystem readiness for AI-based solution, which compels investors to explore edtech for neurodiverse learners. So all in all, what we're seeing is a foundation being built. Digital tools, inclusive education projects, assistive tech, shifting policies, and philanthropic interest. For thoughtful investors and social entrepreneurs, this is one of those quiet sectors where today's experimentation could become tomorrow's success stories. Okay, guys, so that's it on the investment news. So let's move to opportunities and pitfalls for investors. What should investors and social impact players really be paying attention to in this space? Because while the moral argument is clear, the strategic opportunities and risks are equally important. I'll start with the bright side, the opportunities. First, early diagnosis and screening tools is something that would, create a lot of impact as well as profit. There's so much untapped potential there. We're talking digital and AI-based screening apps tailored to African cultural and linguistic context. Please don't forget that. The NASQ app in Nigeria is already proving that this is doable and scalable. Also, inclusive education platforms and teacher training would also be a good thing to look at. With e-learning expanding across Africa, there's room for online certification, blended learning, and upskilling teachers in inclusive pedagogy, especially in rural or peri-urban schools that have never had special needs specialists.
I think I also need to mention that assistive technology and accessibility infrastructure is also an opportunity for investors, yeah. From low-cost speech devices to adaptive classroom furniture and accessible transport. I mean, these are real business opportunities for anyone who is really interested in social impact, okay? Africa's growing middle class is demanding inclusive options, and that's a sign of market readiness. We also want to look into therapy and intervention services. Think speech therapy, behavioral therapy, occupational therapy, delivered via telehealth or hybrid models. Imagine a network of certified therapists reachable from anywhere on the continent. That's an untapped mind, if you ask me, though.
Absolutely. And guys, we cannot overemphasize public-private partnerships. Government and donors are now open to co-designing scalable inclusion programs. Right? If investors step in early, they can help shape frameworks that will later become industry standards. Also, opportunities are opening up in impact investing and environmental, social, and governance alignment. Right? Stability inclusion is now finding its way into ESG dashboards globally. Investing here aligns with both moral and market incentives. Finally, Africa's sheer market size. I mean, Africa is burgeoning with young population, rising awareness, and growing digital infrastructure. This means that there's a significant blue ocean of inclusive service demand that's still unmet. But of course, every opportunity has its shadow side. So, Mubarak, do you want to take the pitfalls?
Well, you said the whole weak data is a big one, yeah. We don't even have consistent prevalences rate or diagnostic data in many countries on the continent, and it makes market sizing, a bit of a guessing game. So we are saying there are opportunities. What are the numbers? It's more or less like saying that we're just trying to give them a guesswork. It might be higher, and it might not even be as prevalent as we think it is. So weak data is a problem in Africa. Regulation is another challenge many investors would face. Many countries have disability laws on paper, but implementation is often sluggish or even uneven. Yeah. Then there's sustainability. Too many promising pilot projects fizzles out when the fizzle out when the grant ends because they weren't designed for scale. Another problem I think that is abound in this particular conversation is stigma and cultural barriers, which also pose real challenges. Services exist, but families avoid them due to fear of judgment. So I think anybody that is going to tackle this problem must first of all look at behavioral change campaign. Before you even start investing, your first point of priority as an investor in this particular context, most especially talking about neurodiverse challenges or developmental issues, you must first focus on the overarching campaign, because that's the only way you can, restructure the minds of people, families who, for fear of judgment, for fear of stigma, they tend to not want to participate in developmental solutions. Not to mention that there's also infrastructure gaps, which makes scaling hard, especially in rural Africa, where clinics, electricity, and, internet are not even available. And, not to forget the shortage of trained professionals, which makes it difficult for the inclusive system to scale. Yeah, there's shortage of trained professionals, there's infrastructure gaps. I can continue to mention some of the challenges you face, but I can tell you for a fact that when you are really ready to start all these problems have solutions, I can assure you.
Thank you so much, Barack, for really spotlighting these issues. Like, you already covered it all basically. I'd just like to add that investors also need to come to terms with the commercial realities when it comes to developmental and impact-driven investments. We're talking about slow return on investment, small margins, dependency on public funding, and unpredictable policy shift. It's not a space for quick profits, but it's a powerful one for investors who are patient, purpose-driven, and just ready to make long-term impact. So what should investors do? Like we always say, build local partnerships, right? You want to get the local support in any initiative that you're doing so that it can be accepted, so that it can be utilized. Also, pilot small, then scale smart. Right? Blend commercial revenue with grants or subsidies rather. Focus on rural access, first mover advantage there. Use digital delivery models to keep costs low. Integrate data system from day one, right? And you also want to work with ministries and government parastatals early, not after you've, ventured into the business, so that you can actually get facts on where to dip your leg and where to just hold back. And most importantly, invest in awareness campaigns, right? You need to push for the utilization of any innovation or anything that you're bringing into the market, because inclusion would not work without community understanding.
You just re-emphasized all I said about the overarching campaign. It is quite necessary for anybody interested in investing in developmental and impact-driven investment, okay? After what we've said, one thing I can tell you is that autism and neurodiversity challenges is more than a health issue, okay? It's an investment frontier for human capital, for education, and for social innovation in Africa. I think what's most striking is that this isn't just about investment or data. It is also about dignity. It's about what kind of society we want to build across Africa. Every child, whether neurotypical or neurodiverse, deserves the chance to learn, to play, and grow without being limited by stigma or circumstance. So when we talk about autism and neurodiversity, we're not only talking about a health condition, we are talking about potential that is waiting to be unlocked. And when inclusion happens, everyone wins, I must tell you. Families become stronger, community become more compassionate, and even our economy also become more innovative.
Yeah, so if you're listening and you're an investor or a policymaker, or maybe you're just a curious young person, I want you to picture the ripple effects. A teacher trained to support a neurodiverse child changes not just one life, but a classroom dynamic forever. A small assistive tech startup in Nairobi or Ibadan could become the next big force in Africa's digital health landscape. A parent who finally gets a diagnosis for their child feels empowered, not ashamed. And that's the heart of what we've been discussing today. The barriers are big, yes, we can't deny that. but the energy for change is bigger. And the more we normalize conversations like this, the faster those barriers crumble.
So as we close the conversation for today, here are 3 takeaways to keep in mind, okay? 1. Autism and neurodevelopmental conditions are more common than most people think in Africa. It's just that awareness has not caught up with all this conversation yet. 2. Every gap we've described is also a potential entry point for innovation, whether technology, education, or grassroots advocacy. And lastly, inclusion is not charity, yeah? It is strategy. It is how we build the kind of Africa that doesn't leave anyone behind. So if you look at all the 3 points, you realize that there is a business opportunity in this particular conversation we've had today. And you might be the next big innovator after this conversation.
I agree with you. Like, I absolutely agree with you. Guys, and that's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for staying with us this far. I mean, we've come a long way from the beginning of this conversation. We hope it sparked ideas. We hope it sparked some empathy and maybe even action in you. And if you found value in today's episode, please subscribe, share, and connect with us on any platform you're listening with, especially if you're working in health, tech, education, advocacy, or disability inclusion. We would absolutely like to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Awa. And also thank you to all our listeners. I think I need to add this. Apart from those working in health tech, education, disability inclusion, I think we need more of developmental communicators as well. Because one thing I've learned about developmental issues is that it is only developmental communicators that can pass the message the way it needed to be passed. It is these people that can create awareness that there are challenges, and these are people that can solve them. So if you're a communicator, you're a PR person, you're a media strategist, connect with us as well, and let's build something worthwhile in Africa. Okay, we hope today's discussion opens your mind to both the challenges and the vast opportunities hidden within Africa's neurodiversity landscape. And until next time, when we'll be back, I'm saying my name is Mubarak Abimbola. I'll see you on the next episode.
Bye, guys.